tariffs, there's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
America is losing Europe. Quietly, almost imperceptibly, but irreversibly. What seemed like a solid trade alliance yesterday is falling apart today, and it's not just numbers on a report card. European supermarket shelves, once dominated by American beef, are now increasingly favoring Canadian beef. Why? What went wrong? And is it really just a matter of taste?
That's a 10. That's a good one. Yeah.
At first glance, everything seems to be the same. The US is one of the world's largest beef producers. Powerful farms, high technology, millions of tons of meat every year. But behind the facade of success, there are warning signs. Over the past 2 years, US beef exports to Europe have plummeted by more than 60%, and the golden quota of 45,000 tons, once reserved exclusively for the US, now goes to its northern neighbor. Canadian farmers are signing multi-billion-dollar contracts, while their American counterparts are forced to sell off their livestock and lay off workers at Tashiwu.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
Is it all about hormones and GMOs? Or is there something more behind it, a crisis of trust? After all, European buyers are increasingly talking not about price, but about transparency. Not about the weight of a steak, but about its origin. Where was the bull raised? What was it fed? What were the conditions like on the farm? And oddly enough, the answers to these questions are more readily available in Alberta than in Texas.
And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
In this video, we explain why Canada, which does not have the same scale as the US, has suddenly become a symbol of a new approach to global trade, how small farmers without big brands are conquering European markets, and why Europe's silent rejection of American beef is not just a trade misunderstanding, but possibly the beginning of the biggest shift in North American agricultural policy in the last 30 years.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
You will learn how a Canadian factory that almost closed after losing contracts in Japan and the US was brought back to life thanks to an order from a single French restaurant chain, which certification programs have become the new passport for premium beef, and why American farmers today have to choose between investing in reforms or leaving the world stage.
US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
America is clenching its fists but losing the market. Canada is silent but gaining trust. What will happen next? Silent surrender or a new round of fighting? Welcome to the quietest, but perhaps most important meat war of our time.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
American beef was once a symbol of power, abundance, and technological leadership. Europe opened its doors to it, granting exclusive quotas, and American farmers proudly talked about their contracts with restaurants in France, Germany, and Belgium. But by 2025, the situation had changed dramatically. Imports of American beef into the EU have fallen by more than 60%, and no one in the US Department of Agriculture is calling this a temporary setback anymore. In just 2 years, once stable exports have turned into a crisis that today threatens not only specific farms, but the entire industry as a whole. Europe no longer wants American meat. Meanwhile, Canada is quietly signing multi-billion-dollar export agreements and filling the vacant positions. What happened? How did the US, a global giant in beef production, end up overboard?
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
There are many answers, and none of them are encouraging. It all started with the golden quota of 45,000 tons of hormone-free beef that the EU had allocated exclusively to the US since 2019. At the time, it was seen as a symbol of trust. Despite deep differences in agricultural policy, the European Union and the United States agreed that if American farmers complied with EU standards, they would get direct access to a highly profitable market. But by 2023, the first cracks were already visible. Some American producers began to complain about excessive bureaucracy, others about the complexity of tracking the origin of each animal. However, the real problem turned out to be deeper.
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
The American meat production system consists of huge feedlots, thousands of cattle, growth hormones, a corn and soybean diet, and a minimum of personnel per ton of meat. This is the logic of scale. Europe, on the other hand, is building its food system on trust, origin, and details. In Germany, the average farm raises a bull for 30 months, without hormones, with pasture feeding and full traceability. French farmers manually sign veterinary cards for each animal. And when a consumer in Paris buys a steak, they literally know which farm it came from. American meat looks foreign in this system, too fast, too big, and too faceless.
I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
But it's not just about romanticism. European laws have banned growth hormones in livestock farming since 1989. American farmers, according to industry analysts, use hormones in 85% of their feed. Yes, the US has created a special program called NEAT, non-hormone treated cattle, but by early 2025, only 14 farms nationwide were participating in it. By comparison, there are nearly 300 such producers in Canada, and their number is growing every month. The EU requires electronic traceability from birth to slaughter. In the US, many states still use a paper-based animal identification system, and bulls are tagged with ordinary plastic tags that cannot be scanned remotely. This leads to mistrust, doubts, and, as a result, a refusal to cooperate. A particularly high-profile case occurred in December 2024, when a shipment of American beef worth €4.2 million was turned back at the French border due to a lack of the necessary documentation of origin. Checks showed that more than 30% of the animals in the shipment had been fattened on farms that purchase calves in Mexico rather than breeding them in the US. According to EU rules, this makes the product unsuitable for the quota. The scandal made headlines. Debates began in Brussels about whether to continue issuing quotas to the US at all. Canada reacted immediately. The Canadian Ministry of Agriculture sent a delegation to the EU, promising full compliance with all European requirements. Within a month, Canada received an additional quota, supposedly temporary. In reality, this marked the beginning of a complete replacement of suppliers. Meanwhile, American farmers began to feel real pressure. One of them, Jack Miller from Nebraska, told a local newspaper how he lost up to $20,000 in the first quarter of 2025 due to the loss of a contract with a German meat chain. His bulls met the standards, were hormone-free, and had a full set of documents, but the order was simply not renewed. They said they were now working with Canada. No explanation, Jack said. This is not an isolated case. According to the US Cattlemen's Association, there are thousands of such stories. In response to falling export demand, farmers began to reduce their herds on a massive scale. Domestic prices began to fall, while at the same time, due to drought and rising feed prices, costs continued to rise. The economy was not doing well. However, the key problem is not even the numbers. It is about the loss of status. For decades, American beef was the gold standard. Even when it was criticized, it remained a symbol. Today, a new player is emerging on the world stage and doing so almost without fanfare. Canada is not shouting from the rooftops. It is not launching advertising campaigns or accusing others of protectionism. It is simply meeting the requirements. It is introducing electronic databases, strengthening certification, and training personnel. And it is working. Can the US regain its position? Perhaps. But it will require a complete overhaul of the system. It will need federal support, investment in technology, and standards that are uniform across the country. Most importantly, it will require a rethinking of the approach. Food is no longer measured in pounds. It is measured in trust. And as the European market shows, there has been a catastrophic shortage of trust in recent years. The crisis in US beef exports to Europe has not been limited to quotas and standards. Its consequences have been felt much more deeply, affecting the everyday economy of farmers, processors, and entire regions. Where stable supplies to Europe used to guarantee confidence in the future, uncertainty now reigns. And the most worrying thing is that many farmers believe they have met all the requirements, invested money, changed processes, switched to hormone-free feed and traceability, but it has all been in vain. Orders have disappeared. There is no support, and the domestic market, to which they were forced to return, is already oversaturated. Prices on the US domestic market have begun to fluctuate amid oversupply. Steers that used to sell for over $1,500 in Europe are now barely selling for $1,480, and some even cheaper, especially if the farmer cannot provide large volumes at once. At the same time, production costs remained high, especially after the switch to hormone-free methods. According to calculations by an independent consulting firm in Colorado, the loss per head in the first quarter of 2025 averaged $120. In terms of a farm, that's tens of thousands of dollars lost per season. And when you factor in packaging, logistics, and veterinary inspections, the numbers get even more depressing. But money isn't the only thing being lost. Infrastructure is being lost. Processing plants that previously operated these every shifts have begun to cut back. One of the largest plants in Kansas, which supplied beef for export to the EU, has officially announced the elimination of its night shift. That's 218 jobs. Most of the employees were from local families, and for many, this was their only source of income. Local unions even tried to draw attention to the situation at the federal level, but to no avail. The Department of Agriculture merely stated that the market is changing and the support program is under review. Some regions began to feel the effects of a chain reaction. For example, in Wayne County, Nebraska, where about 40% of GDP is directly dependent on livestock and related industries, a 17% drop in turnover was recorded in the spring of 2025 compared to the previous year. 2 transportation companies that transported chilled beef closed, and 1 packaging plant declared bankruptcy. Banks began calling in credit lines from small farmers, citing increased risk of default. One farmer, Terry Jameson, who had been working on export contracts for 12 years, was forced to mortgage his land to pay off his debts to his creditor. "I don't know how it happened. We did everything by the book," he says. "They just wiped us out in an instant." The moral blow was almost as hard as the economic one. Those who had been part of the US export strategy for decades now feel abandoned. According to a recent survey by the Beef Producers Association, more than 60% of farmers in Iowa, Kansas, and Missouri admitted to feeling a loss of status and uncertainty about the future due to the reduction in foreign shipments. There is a growing belief among them that the government is protecting large agribusiness conglomerates while ignoring the needs of medium and small farms. Players such as Tyson Foods, Jabes, and Cargill are indeed continuing to expand their capacity, with access to investment and processing opportunities in Asia. But hundreds of independent farmers not included in these chains have been left in limbo. Some have started selling off their livestock, others have frozen equipment upgrades. Still others are considering switching to alternative forms of land use, such as organic farming or even leasing land for solar power stations, simply to maintain their income. Meanwhile, the opposite was happening in Canada. Farmers there seemed to be quietly building up their export infrastructure. One particularly telling case was the Beeflex plant in Alberta. After the pandemic, it lost almost 40% of its contracts in the US and Japan and was already planning to cut staff. But in early 2025, it received a large order from a restaurant chain in France on the condition that all beef would be hormone-free, fully traceable, CURSB certified, and labeled certified tender. Management accepted the challenge. In 8 months, they completely modernized the slaughter line, introduced an electronic identification system, and hired additional quality specialists. Not only did they save the business, but they also increased their staff by 120 people. Local media called it the return of Canadian beef's honor. The Americans watched this with skepticism. How could Canada, with a smaller production volume, get ahead of them? The answer, according to industry experts, is simple. The Canadians started adapting earlier. As early as 2021, the Canadian government began subsidizing sustainable production programs. By 2023, 70% of Canadian exports met EU and Japanese requirements. The US, meanwhile, hoped that size matters, but it turned out that in today's world, a product's history is more important than its tonnage. While Europe was refocusing on Canada, there were behind-the-scenes discussions in the US about whether it was worth spending billions on rebuilding the system to return to a market where Americans are now perceived as an opaque partner. Some officials proposed bilateral agreements to soften EU requirements, but Brussels made it clear that the rules were the same for everyone, and consumer preferences were even stricter. One contract, one scandal over origin, one mistake, and a brand disappears from store shelves for years. The US found itself at a crossroads, and while farmers in southern Texas were selling their cattle at reduced prices on the domestic market, in the north in Saskatchewan, Canadian packers were preparing another batch of meat for Luxembourg, Zurich, and Oslo. On the same day, some lost, others gained. And it was no longer about meat. It was about the system. The situation that had developed in the global beef market by mid-2025 made it increasingly clear that this was not just a redistribution of suppliers. This was not just a temporary decline in interest in American products. This was a paradigm shift. The world no longer buys meat based solely on taste, weight, and price. The world demands history, trust, and a clear, verifiable origin. This is precisely what has become Canada's main competitive advantage, enabling it to transform itself in just 3 years from a second-tier supplier to a reliable, respected supplier of premium meat for the most demanding markets. And it did so without loud slogans, pressure, or dumping. Only through transparency, consistency, and continuity. Against the backdrop of the American downturn, when thousands of farmers in Missouri, Texas, and Colorado were losing export contracts and selling their livestock at a loss, Canada continued to grow its influence. Canadian beef exports in the first quarter of 2025, despite a 9% decline in volume, showed a 2% increase in revenue. How is this possible? Its simple added value. The average price per ton of exported meat rose from $9,500 to almost $9,800 Canadian dollars. The reason lies in certification, traceability, and most importantly, trust. While the US stubbornly ignored signals from Europe, considering EU requirements excessive and politicized, Canada simply began to comply. Programs such as VEP, on farm safety and quality control, CRESP, sustainable livestock production, and certified tender, texture and juiciness testing became part of a real production standard rather than an advertising campaign. Moreover, they began to be implemented even on small farms which were offered tax breaks and subsidies for participating in national certification projects.